Rebel Arsenal, Weapons of the Confederacy, Part 1. At the beginning of the American Civil War in the spring of 1861, the newly formed Confederate States of America found itself in an arms race with its former countrymen from the United States, an arms race that it had to win in order to achieve its independence. Due to its limited industrial capacity, the Confederacy produced only a fraction of the weapons that its northern adversaries made during the same time. Thus, the South relied heavily on weapons imported from European nations and trade for Southern cotton. This gave the Confederate States a significant disadvantage in its fight for independence. Nonetheless, a wide variety of weapons were allocated into the Southern arsenal that came from a variety of locations and sources. These weapons were produced across the Confederacy in many forms and calibers. These resources, along with European imports, allowed the Confederacy to have enough weapons to stay in the conflict until it was overwhelmed by superior military might from Union forces in the spring of 1865. At the beginning of the war, after the attack on Fort Sumter and Charleston Harbor in 1861, the Confederacy had limited militaristic resources in its fight for independence. There were a few armories scattered throughout the South. Most of these armies were private contractors that only produced weapons in limited quantities. The only notable armory in the South that produced small arms on a mass scale was the National Armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, now West Virginia. The only problem for the rebels was that the armory was still under federal control when Virginia seceded. In order to have an edge in the upcoming conflict, there was a need to seize the army with minimal casualties. On April 18, 1861, Virginia militia under Turner Ashby attacked the arsenal to allocate its contents. The Federals were aware of the incoming raid and set fire to the facility. The weapons were destroyed, but the machinery remained, which were thus captured and brought to Richmond for repurposing. This salvage ensured that the Richmond facility produced much of the small arms that were needed by the Confederate Army in the upcoming conflict. Virginia's presence in the Confederacy was essential for the nation's survival. It was the most populated southern state with over 1 million inhabitants. It had the highest number of railroads and manufacturing sites, which manpower and transportation outlets allowed for natural resources to be concentrated in one centralized location. This importance is why Richmond was selected as the national capital after Virginia's secession. During this time, there was a call for a roundup of any weapons that could be used in the upcoming conflict. Quote, anything that would shoot, unquote, was requested, and soldiers were encouraged to bring their own weapons with them if they had any. Thus, many of the early weapons of the Confederacy were older models and pre-war weapons that were purchased from the federal government, including the model 1817 smoothbore flintlock rifle and many variations of the Springfield rifle musket that were produced before the outbreak of the war. It is estimated that there were around 260,000 pre-existing serviceable firearms in the South in 1861. The South was always plagued by supply shortages, and its firearms manufacturing capability was no exception. Many locations that were chosen to be arsenals had to start from scratch, and pre-existing armories had to rapidly expand production. This expansion was met with limited results, but provided Confederate forces with adequate numbers of weapons for the conflict. Most of these locations were put into service towards the latter half of the war, when it became clear that Richmond was under threat and other arsenals needed to step up production if Richmond would be captured by federal forces. Once the machinery from Harper's Ferry was restored, small arms production was ramped up in Richmond. The Tredegar Ironworks was selected as the site for production. This site already produced firearms in a limited capacity, so this line of work was nothing new for the people that were already employed there. For the first few months of the war, the facility was operated by the Virginia government. Operation oversight was turned over to the Confederate government in the fall of 1861. During the initial salvage at Harper's Ferry, the barrel rolling machine was left behind because of its weight. This machinery was essential because it drastically reduced the amount of time it took to wheel barrel seams to the rifles. Retrieval was worth the gamble, and a successful mission was launched to bring it to Richmond in January 1862. This ensured that most barrels produced in the Confederacy were made in Richmond and shipped to other depots. The most noble weapon produced at Tredegar Ironworks was the namesake Richmond rifle musket. Early productions of this weapon were based on the pattern the Harper's Ferry produced U.S. model 1855. In fact, many early models of the rifle produced in 1861 and 1862 were made from Harper's Ferry parts. It took some time before most of the models were produced solely from Richmond manufactured parts. It was a .35 caliber with a 40-inch barrel. While the principal design remained during the war, there were small modifications that tried to improve the quality of the rifle muskets. One of the major downfalls of the operation in Richmond was that even though they had machinery that could make interchangeable parts, the finished result was seldom the case. Because of the war, their goal was to make as many rifles as possible without paying much attention to quality. This essentially became the case when Harper's Ferry parts were used up and new parts had to be created. It is estimated that around 323,231 infantry arms were produced in Richmond during the course of the war, though a significant amount of these arms were battlefield repairs, with only 39,600 solely produced in Richmond. Nonetheless, this is considerably less than the number that were simultaneously made at the Springfield Armory in Massachusetts, which produced nearly 1.5 million. This lack of resources meant the Confederacy had to rely on other sources to supply its armies with enough rifle muskets to fight back against the Federal opponents. Production in Richmond concluded on April 2, 1865, when Confederate forces defending the city had to evacuate the capital after nearby Petersburg fell to Federal forces. The Harper's Ferry machinery was loaded onto a train bound for Danville, Virginia, and like the rest of the city, the armory was torched by the retreating Confederates. On April 27th, the train was captured in Danville, its contents removed, and the Harper's Ferry machinery went missing without a trace. Thus ended the Confederacy's best effort to compete with its northern foe in the rifle race.